Hello again. So now to begin on this overview of the United Kingdom from what we might call the beginning of the modern period to 1688. And I'll say this from the outset: 1688 is going to sort of be a focal point that is going to enable you to really distinguish the broad lines of what happens in the UK. Okay, so we're going to go up to that point, and at the end of this video, I'm really going to try to focus on what does this mean? What is this glorious revolution, the 1688? And I really want you to have a solid sense of what that is, because it's really going to be able to make you talk about, let's say, a text written in 1650 in a much different way from a text that is going to be written in, let's say, the 20th century, right? It's very important for you to take that into account, for you to get inside what someone is talking about or writing about. So I just said that we're going to be talking about what can be referred to as the beginning of the modern period up until 1688. So I have to sort of say that more clearly. What am I talking about the modern period? Well, first of all, the one reason I'm choosing the modern period, one definition of the modern period is basically starting what begins with the Renaissance, right? Or sort of following the Middle Ages, right? There's a lot of definitions of what people call the modern age. You can define it from the Renaissance onward. It can also be defined as the industrial age. There are some historians who will say, real modernity begins with the industrial age. There it is, and it can also be associated with you're probably aware of the literary movement, referred to as modernism or high modernism, which really refers to the beginning of the 20th century. So what we're talking about here, it's good to know that there's sort of three different periods we can be talking about when we're talking about the modern age. We can, and in another sort of more familiar way, it can also refer to sort of contemporary culture, what's happening now, right? In a certain context, right? So we can use this word in four different ways, right? Here, I'm going to be talking about the period that immediately follows the Middle Ages, right? And one of the reasons for that is that the set of documents that you are asked to consider, none of them are going to be from the Middle Ages. I've never seen, for example, Chaucer. If you specialize, let's say, in literature, you might be expected to treat Chaucer, but Chaucer is written in Middle English, right? Middle English, and it's written in the late 14th century, right? It's really hard to read. To be honest, I need a dictionary to get through a page of Chaucer. It's going to take me a long time, and there are going to be a slew of words that I'm not going to understand because I don't know Latin and Middle English well enough. So because of that, I don't want to say that I can say with certainty that it's because of that, but you are not going to be asked to discuss a text from the 14th century. So you can breathe a sigh of relief, and that might sort of be I don't know. That might just be assured that you don't have to review, Middle English. You don't need to know Middle English to get your CAPS. So it's sort of convenient. So we're going to be starting from the Renaissance. On the other hand, you may very well get a text from the Renaissance, and of course, when we talk about the Renaissance, we could be talking about someone. For example, we could talk about someone like Francis Bacon, right? Who is a we could call him, let's say, it's difficult to sort of qualify writers from this period, but we could say he's sort of a philosopher. You could get something from Shakespeare. You could get something from John Donne. You could get something from Afraben, etc. Yes, these are the kind of it is very likely. Possible and likely that you'll get a text from a writer from this period. So obviously it's really important to take into account what is happening when these writers are writing, because they're going to write in a different way because of this, right? And the advantage of being aware of sort of what we might call the mindset of this period is that it would be pretty difficult for me. I just talked about John Donne. It would be, I'm not going to ask you to go out and, review the metaphysical poets, right? Okay, if I say John Donne, I could be talking about Andrew Marvell, and, I could go on. And you might really start worrying that you have to go out and read, all the Renaissance poets, and that would be, a very substantial undertaking. And you don't want to have to fill your head with that much verse, for example, right? Okay, but if you, on the other hand, if you are aware sort of the mindset of this period, you really have a key, you really have much more access to these writers than you would otherwise not have. So you might want to think of the things I'm going to talk about here as sort of a shortcut. I can sort of say sort of a key, sort of a way to get sort of underneath or sort of into what a lot of these writers are going to be talking about. So let's talk about what this modern period is, starting from the Renaissance. So it's a fusion of a lot of things that are going on. Now we're talking about the end of the Middle Ages, right? Meaning that these are things that but I'm kind of going to synthesize a few things here. So that means that we're talking about sort of the end of the feudal system, right? Okay, meaning we have sort of a landed aristocracy that have serfs that are attached to the land, and it's important to note that in the feudal system, that there are a significant number of lords, right, who are lords of the land that they possess, right, and this means that power is distributed differently in the Middle Ages, right? Okay, the king per se. Is not, even though he is sort of at the top of the feudal chain, right? There are often conflicts as to who is the servant of another in the feudal system. It's ironic because in the beginning, right, and one date you should always keep in mind because you're an English specialist, you can know sort of one date of English history, you can know 1066, right? The Norman invasion, right? William the Conqueror. What was exceptional at the beginning of English society was that William the Conqueror actually was, because of the way that he defeated the King Harold, he defeated him absolutely, right? And he became the sole possessor of all the land in England, which meant that at the time of 1066, and it's important also to know that he was French, right? He was a Norman, and so in the beginning of the Middle Ages, we have William the Conqueror who distributes all the land of the country to all his vassals, right, who are going to be French. By the way, French is the first language for the landed aristocracy from that date, 1066, until I would say the middle end of the 14th century, right? And which is why I talked about Chaucer. Chaucer is writing at this time, and Chaucer is someone who sort of gives the English language, as we say, les lettres de noblesse, right? Because French kings, someone like Richard the Lionheart, for example, who's he's an English king, right? But he writes poetry and he writes in French, right? So that might seem exceptional. It might seem incredible, right? It's actually hard to believe, but it is the case, right? So even though the feudal system exists in sort of the purest form, where all the lords, let's say in the beginning, from the outset, were sort of vassals of William the Conqueror, over time, conflicts evolved between different lords and the king, right? And if you're aware at all of European history, this is common to sort of all, to Europe in general, right? And this means that there is this also has to do with the fact that we in a sense, even though there are by the way, there's a shared system of common law, right? And even though, of course, one of the major unifying principles of society is, of course, the church, right? Okay, and at this time, it's important to note that England is Catholic. We're going to talk about that, right? In the Middle Ages, even though there are, common law, which is different from Roman law, as it is practiced in France, right? Even though there are unifying principles of law and religion, right? Okay, there is this idea that there are significant differences in different sort of miniature kingdoms, depending on who your lord is, right? Okay. And this leads to wars, right? Between lords, right? And this, by the way, actually comes to this is sort of the accumulation of this is what is known as the Wars of the Roses. And this is, by the way, if you ever read Shakespeare's play, Richard III, for example, that discusses the end of those feudal wars, right? Okay, he has a whole series of plays, the Henry VI, the third parts ends in Henry III. It's interesting to note that that's Shakespeare is a Renaissance author writing about sort of the end of romanticizing. And well, yes, it's always more complicated than we think with Shakespeare, but he's writing about sort of a disappeared era. He's writing about the end of the Middle Ages, right? In the end of chivalry, if you were. So we have. I want to make sure that I'm not confusing you with too much information, but I want to make sure that you retain sort of the main ideas. We have the Wars of the Roses, which are between, as you're aware, the houses of Lank, right? The Duke, you can say the nobles associated with the houses of York and Lancaster, right? Who fight amongst themselves, right? Okay, so those wars go on. These immediately follow the 100 Years' War, right? Which is between more or less between, we can say, France and England, right? So they immediately, which is once again, we're talking about the Middle Ages. So the culmination of the Middle Ages, and you can think about the transition into the modern age, right? Happens really at the end of the Wars of the Roses, which go from 1455 to 1487, right? So 1487 is the final battle of the War of the Roses. That is the end of Shakespeare's play Richard III. That is when he says, "My kingdom for a horse." Right, that famous line is on the deciding battle of the War of the Roses. So in 1487, okay, the War of the Roses are over, and this can be thought of as the time where it was the end of nobles within England, actually fighting wars from one noble house against another, right? And this goes along with, and it's the establishment of what is known as the House of Tudor, and the first king in the House of Tudor is Henry VII. So Henry VII becomes the king in 1487, okay, marking the end of the Wars of the Roses, right? So he becomes the king, right? And it's important to note that this is sort of the birth of a major tendency which goes from, here we're talking about late 15th century to the beginning, but through the 17th century, which is this idea of the monarchy becoming much stronger, right? The power of the king, right, is greatly increased with respect to the power of his, the nobles, which become sort of his underlings, right? Okay, so the hierarchy is reinforced, right? And this goes together with sort of a much more centralized form of government, which means what we're really talking about is sort of the emergence of the power of the state, right? And this is sort of a big deal. This really is a huge change in the way society works. And this is reflected in language. Language becomes a lot more regular, right? You're aware of the fact that, in different, for example, if we are to read, let's say, these Shakespeare's history plays that discuss what's going on in this period, there is a Welsh character named Glendower, right? And no one can, and he's from Wales, and no one can understand what he's saying, right? People make fun of him, make fun of his. Now, in modern, when I say modern, right, beginning from the Renaissance England, these differences, right, okay, these sort of local differences become more and more stamped out, right? There's a greater and greater regularization. And it's a progressive thing, right? But the major shift really happens, with the advent of what I'm referring to as the modern age, right? Meaning sort of the Renaissance. Okay, so there is a greater linguistic regularity, right? There is a greater centralization of power, right? And there is the emergence of the state, right? And all of this goes hand in hand with the increase of the power of the monarch, right? So that's important to understand, because you can really actually talk about language. If you're going to read a Renaissance poet, you can say that. You can talk about the grammar. You can say this grammar seems like it's a little bit all over the place. We're not really fully at sort of in the modern age, and you can say the language reflects this, right? The little nooks and crannies and the irregularities reflect a society that is a much more heterogeneous in form. So that's one thing to retain. I would say that it's really, I'm going to repeat on those basic ideas, but sort of the emergence of the centralized government, the state, and the power of the monarch, right? So that really starts with the House of Tudor, right? And the first Tudor king is Henry VII, right? Now, as I said, at this time, England is part of what is known as Christendom, right? It is a Catholic country, meaning that the king is considered to be the secular head of the state, and the Pope is the head of we could say religion, and there's always debates about who names bishops, but it's different in France. But the Pope is going to be the one who names bishops and is the head of religion, to put it simply. Now, Henry VII's son, right, is a king we're much more familiar with than Henry VII, right? By the way, it's important to note that I talked about Wales, right? And we're talking about the regularization of the country. We're aware of the fact that we have Ireland, we have Wales, and we have Scotland. Now, the Tudors, right, which are Henry VII's family, they actually are, well, they are of Welsh origin, and that has a lot to do with the fact that Wales becomes better integrated into the United Kingdom, right, with the advent of Henry VII's reign. Okay, so we have Henry VII is sort of the first, we could say, modern ruler of English, with sort of this. I'm not going to say we're going to talk about absolute power, but we're going to say with sort of a vastly increased temporal power with respect to the nobles. His son is Henry VIII, right? Okay, and you're aware of the course of Henry VIII and his wives. Now, it's important to note that, and this is sort of a major event that has to do with religion here. So we have Henry VIII, and he was kind of lucky because his father was very good at saving money and creating an efficient centralized state. Henry VIII was much better at cutting the heads off of his successive wives, but he wanted to divorce. Anne Boleyn is the name of his first wife. Now, he wanted to divorce his first wife, right? And he needed the approval of the Pope. I'm telling the story that you know very well, right? Okay, so. And this approval was the Pope refused to give Henry VIII the permission to divorce his wife. So at this point, Henry VIII decides to dismiss the Roman Catholic Church, right? And it's a long process, but and this is the establishment is what is known as the Church of England, right? Okay, so it's really important to note, and that is why at the time it wasn't. It had Protestant sort of, I would say, overtones, right? But it wasn't, per se. It wasn't. A lot of Henry VIII's advisors, they claimed that as far as sort of what the Church of England represented, they claimed that the Church of England still maintained all the dogma that was held by the Catholic Church, but over time, right, the Protestant, I would say, tendencies became more pronounced, right? Okay, so that's an important thing, that to this day there exists a Church of England, right, and that means the monarch is sort of the head of the church as well. Okay, and that's something that's specific to England, and so notice that this also goes along with this idea of sort of centralization, and the fact that this does also tend to reinforce the idea that the king has sort of increased power, right? No longer dependent on the Pope. And this is what is referred to as the schism, right? And by the way, it should be dissociated from there is another schism in medieval Europe, right? Which is referred to as the Great Schism. But here we have the schism in England, right? Which is in 1538, with the establishment of the Church of England. So we're here we're fully in full sway with the Renaissance, and just to sort of going to quickly go forward. just be aware of the fact that, also in the House of Tudor, we're probably the most famous. We have the most famous two Renaissance monarchs are Henry VIII, and then we have Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, who is a queen from 1587 to 1603, right? And so it's important to just be aware of this time, because this is when Shakespeare is writing, and this is sort of considered to be sort of the heyday of I don't know, in many respects, especially when we talk about sort of English writing and poetry, this is sort of a high point in English culture. It's also really important to note that this is where colonialism is going to come up again and again. Under Elizabeth, as we have, once again, we have the power of England is, extending itself. We have here we have a significant development of the colonial empire, right? Nothing like the way it develops in the towards the middle end of the 19th century, but it's a significant expansion, competing with the Dutch and the Portuguese colonial empires, and this goes along with the creation of the East India Company, which from the time of Elizabeth has permanent, from what used to be just minor trading posts in what is today India. We have the establishment of the first colonies per se are date from this time, right? And that so we could sort of talk about these general tendencies, and now we arrive at the 17th century, right? In the 17th century, of course, we can always think of different historical periods being sort of an extension and sort of a break with what comes before, and I'll talk about how the 17th century is a break with what we have seen from the 16th century. So it's always also a good idea to be able to, you get a century and you can say this is the century of this, right? 19th century, you're going to say this is the century of industrialization and the class struggle. Just keep that in your brain. That will enable you to really make sense of just about any document from the 19th century. Okay. Now with the 17th century, you don't have to look at it this way, but I think probably the most helpful label. It's really convenient to have just a single label that you're not going to forget, and that is going to, once again, it's going to be sort of a key to a lot of different texts. A very helpful label, and we're going to talk about the manifold repercussions of this, would be to say that the 17th century is the century of science, right? Which means that if we're looking at this in terms of opposition, it's going to mean that the 16th century is pre-scientific, right? And it's important to, and that's going to sort of be our guiding light to understanding, the 17th century. And if you will, I said that 1688 is going to be sort of a date, the Glorious Revolution. And I always feel silly saying the Glorious Revolution. I'm not saying it, I consider it to be a glorious thing. It's actually an open question, but that's what it is. That is the title of what happens in 1688 that we're going to look at later. But we can think of 1688 being sort of the summit and the sort of the victory of science over pre-scientific reasoning. And that doesn't make sense now, right? I'm going to try to, when I say that's a little bit abstract. Science can be very abstract, but hopefully I'm going to enable you to make sense of that. So here we are, we're talking about the 17th century, and I'm saying, well, what does that mean to say that the 17th century is the century of science? Okay. Because of course, we're not saying that the 17th century is not religious, right? And by the way, talking about under Elizabeth, there are still we can have religious heretics under Elizabeth. They're burned at the stake. She's a queen until 1603, and this continues throughout the 17th century. But first of all, it's good to keep in mind the fact that we have the philosopher Francis Bacon. There's a good chance that you'll get a text from him, and he sort of makes a plea for the establishment of a sort of a more scientific method as far as the studying. And the idea is this goes for studying all things in general. Now we're talking about, let's say, political systems. How does this idea of the 17th century being the century of science, how does this relate to political systems? And by the way, this is something that can really be helpful for looking at current events in the English-speaking world. If it could be argued that, notice, we have seen up until